Hello, welcome to this game review. So in this game we will study an endgame mostly, but until the endgame there's still quite a bit to see. So it started as a 2-knight Scarecrow, and the black played this tempting move d4, which kind of makes sense to take a lot of space and play c5, but unfortunately black just cannot do this because when he's playing black he doesn't have enough pieces to defend his newly found space. And after c3, and black's space collapses, there's no way to defend this. For example, after knight c6, white can take and play queen e4. This not only attacks d4 but also creates a pin. So after this, black has to give up a pawn. For example, if he pushes, then after knight e to d4, this pawn will eventually be lost, as it is too far advanced. So after c3, black would have to take, white would take back, and he has the center. So this doesn't work for black. So he tries bishop g4, and white takes the pawn on d4, but even better was to move away the knight with tempo, knight e5, and now it's not the bishop attacking the knight, it's the knight attacking the bishop, and suddenly black is close to losing. If, for example, if he takes here, then after the bishop takes back, this is a very painful check that is threatened, and the black doesn't have the light squared bishop, so he is in big trouble. For example, knight c6, there's queen e4, bishop b5 next. At some point this pawn on d4 might drop also, and black is in big trouble. So cd instead. Now black has the chance to save his pawn by taking here. But still white is a bit better, mainly due to black's bad development and this pawn on d4, which might become a weakness if played precisely. Here the best move would be queen b3. This attacks b7 and also aims to look at this pawn at some point. And for example, if black defends, then now the c6 square is terribly weakened, and he cannot play knight c6 to defend the pawn. So instead queen e4 was played, but after knight c6 it's hard to get this pawn back, and if the pawn is not taken back then this queen is a bit misplaced, and also white does have some long-term weaknesses like the f4 square, the f3 pawn. So white has to play dynamically. So okay, d3, e5, and now bishop h3. But this is sort of a empty diagonal for the bishop. There's no important squares here. Instead, white should try to solve his problems with the doubled pawns and also try to weaken this again. Perhaps play f4 at some point. Maybe develop the bishop first, put the rook on c1. White should in general be playing on the queen side, as that is where his pieces are. But after bishop h3, now knight f6, knight g3, so white is putting all of his pieces on the king side, but there isn't really much to do on the king side, especially after something like g6. The knight and the bishop will not really have access to any important squares here. Again, white should try to get rid of one of the doubled pawns, eventually play f4, maybe castle, put the king on h1 safely, and play on the queen side or even the king side. But knight g3, white gets a check, and this is an interesting mistake, bishop d2. It might look like the most natural move in the world, but after these bishops are exchanged, the weakness on f4 is emphasized, and now this bishop is even worse due to no pieces being able to defend this square. Instead, white should have put his king on e2, which looks like a strange square, but it is rather safe here. White will play f4 next, bring his rook to the game, and this bishop on b4 is not very well placed, it will be kicked around. But okay, bishop d2, and here black decides to go for an endgame, which is not a very good decision, because black has the safer king, white has the less safe king, and also black has some potential to put a knight on f4. But instead he goes to an endgame, and now in the endgame this king is quite well placed. So white is a little bit better here, mainly because he has the bishop against the knight. Also, these knights at the moment are very poorly placed. They want to go to f4, but they are not allowed. So rook a1, white develops the rook, knight c6, and knight f5. But here the knight went to d6 after rook a b8. White played a3, but this move doesn't seem to do much, Maybe white wants to play b4, but this is a bit slow. White should try to create big threats on the queen side. He already has a good knight. He should be trying to improve this rook. So one way to do this is to play rook c5 and put the other rook on c1. This way both of our rooks will be playing. And another idea is, for example, b3, with the idea to take on b7, because now if the rook takes back, we will take here, and this pawn on b2 will not be hanging anymore. So this makes some pressure on black to do something about the threat on b7. But okay, a3. Now after rook f8 we would like to play knight b7, but now it's not that great because b2 is hanging. So knight goes to f5, and again white's pieces are a bit uncoordinated. White would love to play f4 somehow, but it's not happening. So g6 and the knight h6. But unfortunately this just exchanges white's only knight, and suddenly white is just losing positionally because his bishop on h3 cannot really do anything. Instead, white should put his knight on e2 and play f4, hopefully. But after this, we get this endgame, and black should probably avoid the knight exchange. Now he got the chance to put his knight on f4 finally, while white's knight is terribly placed, and actually it's even trapped after f5. So this coordination by white is not very good. White should work a bit on his piece coordination. But here white is still surviving, h5, knight a5. But this is kind of hope chess, while black is trying to give a fork, but this just lets the rook invade to the 7th rank, which white should have done. But okay, king e2, rook c5, and the rook g1. It's not clear what the rook is trying to do on g1. It should probably go to the open c file. But okay, rook g1, b6, and a few moves later white recognizes the c file, and now after b6 the square on c6 has been weakened, which means black's knight will have to move. It moves here, and white plays rook c7, which is sensible enough. Even more precise was b4, after which the knight is almost trapped. It cannot go here because it's running out of squares. It cannot go here, it has to go to b7, and as a rule on these fianchettoed squares, knights are terribly placed, especially when there's a pawn here dominating it. And at this point white is close to winning. He will double his rooks on the 7th rank, probably pick up a pawn or two, maybe even checkmate the king. But rook c7 is also fine. Something similar happens. At this point white is close to winning because he's a pawn up. He still has the bishop, which is better than this knight at the moment. But black does have his resources. He should try to improve his king. But f6, rook c7, and now we get a minor piece endgame, which is close to winning for white, because in general just the bishop is better than the knight, especially in the endgame, and at this point white has an extra pawn, and he has this majority on the queen side. So with this king so far away, this bishop and these pawns should be able to queen, for example here. If here, then the game is basically over, the knight is completely trapped. Otherwise the knight can go here. After b4, again, if it goes there it will get trapped, and if here it's just terribly placed, a4, we can bring the king, and white is winning. But okay, bishop e6. Now the king went to f1, which is hard to understand because the play is supposed to be on the queen side. White should try to create a queen with his pawn majority, but somehow this goes south. The white king goes to g2, which is a very bad square, and soon even black starts playing for the win. At this point white is still doing very well, but not after king f1. We should play b4, with the point that after knight b3, again this knight might get trapped, but here specifically a4 wins, because in this race black's knight is not in time to stop the pawn. For example, like this, after a4, a6, the knight is not stopping the pawn. So this would have required some calculation, but at this point only b4 wins. But king f1 is way too slow. After knight b3, there's the threat of knight c1 picking up this pawn, And this bishop on h5 is horribly placed. Again, white is placing his pieces very poorly. Okay, knight e2, king e2. At this point, again, white should try to push his passed pawns. Not sure what other plan can even be possible here for white. He has 2 pawns against 1, so this is a potential passed pawn. After king c2, suddenly it's black that is close to winning. Knight e4, and at this point, after king b3, b5, black also has his counterplay. He wants to take the f2 pawn and promote the g pawn. So bishop e8 happens, knight c3, and a4. So this is a good move. This is the only move for white to survive and go to some queen endgame. Well, firstly pawn endgame, but it becomes a queen endgame. And at this point, the position is completely drawn, of course, but unfortunately, white loses on time at this point. But objectively, the position should be a draw. So there was quite a lot to see here, but mainly a question arises as to why white was not trying to create a passed pawn with his 2-on-1 majority.